Great to see everybody here on this cold night. You've come into a nice warm shelter where your mind will be abuzz and heated up by the end of this evening's talk and conversation. I'm Gleaves Whitney. I'm the Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. On behalf of the Ford Presidential Library, Museum, and Foundation, really happy to see you here, to welcome you here to another in this great series, this whole series of 8, 1 down, 7 to go. And it is, I tell you, it's a partnership. I've said to Michael Van Denen, this is a partnership we are so happy to be a part of. I think it's entirely consistent with what Jerry Ford would want us to do, and that's to raise our international IQ, our geographic IQ about neighbors around the world, and it's just wonderful to have the stimulating speakers that we have address some of the great topics we do. So I'm just delighted that you're here and look forward to our future events together. And now I'd like to have Erica come aboard, and you're going to make an introduction, and then we're going to get on with the program.
Sounds great.
Okay, thanks a lot, Erica.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's second program in our 8-week Great Decision series with topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association. I'm Erica Kubik, Director of Programming for the Council, and on behalf of my colleagues Rachel Brooks, Abigail Stead, and Michael Van Denen, as well as the Board of Directors of the Council, thank you for your attendance, both here in person and online. It's our mission to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. To change the world, we believe one must first know the world. And you can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. We're pleased to host the Great Decision series at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum and deeply grateful to the museum staff and to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation for this partnership and support. Thank you as well to the GRCC and museum video teams for their expertise enabling our live stream broadcast. We express our appreciation to WGVU Public Media as presenting media sponsor and to the Community Media Center as communication partner. And now let me introduce our presenter for the evening. Dr. Gay-Antaki's work focuses on human-environment relations in the era of anthropogenic global climate change. She draws from the frameworks of political ecology and feminist geography to trace climate change policy development as a series of network connections ranging from formal political spaces, such as the UN Conference of the Parties, to scientific spaces, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to the towns and communities where climate policies are implemented. Her work also investigates the participation and sometimes the exclusion of women scientists and stakeholders in international climate change research and policy arenas. She received her PhD and MS in Geography and Development at the University of Arizona and a BA from Wellesley College. Tonight, Dr. Gay-Antaki is honored to be distinguished as a visiting geographical scientist listed by the American Association of Geographers and International Geographical Honor Society. Tonight's lecture is supported by these two geographical organizations and sponsored by Grand Rapids Community College as this evening's topic sponsor. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gay-Antaki.
Good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak about my work on power and climate change, how inequality impedes effective international collaboration. I'm truly honored to have been invited. And before I continue with my presentation, there's a lot of thanks that I want to give. So thank you so much. Eric already mentioned them, but to the International Geographical Honor Society Visiting Geographical Scientists Program, none of this rolls off the tongue, so bear with me, managed by the American Association of Geography, of course, to, this is okay. To the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan for providing this platform, and I hope that it creates some interesting dialogue after my talk. I'm looking forward to that. And of course, thank you so much, Mike DeVivo, for inviting me. I'm really honored, and for all that you do for geographers, truly keeping geography alive. It truly makes a difference. And thank you so much also to Erica, because we all know that without you, this probably would not have happened. So thank you. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about power and climate change. This might seem very intangible, and so what I'm going to do and what I try to do with all of my work is really ground dynamics that I observe. So I investigate power dynamics through different projects that explore gender relations in climate action, so material impacts, in climate policy, so the politics around policy creation, and in climate science. And today, as you can see, I will focus on the politics around policy creation. I just simply don't have time to talk about my entire research agenda, but I'd be happy to discuss this with you during the Q&A. And so while my focus is always on gender dynamics, and that is something that guides the entirety of my framework and how I think through things, today I will focus on the dynamics between countries and mostly how gender is used as a tool to advance certain countries' agendas. So how does one study power? And I think the best way to just explain this to you is by talking to you about my work, a vignette of my field work. So I found myself in a meeting room at the Conference of the Parties at Glasgow in 2021. And in this meeting room, they were negotiating the composition of a board that was on technology set to give advice to the United Nations Framework Convention on climate change. I noticed a real palpable tension in the room between the global north and the global south. So for maybe some of us that are not familiar with these terms, in human geography, at least we're not using developed and developing countries. We use global north for developed and global south for developing. So this is a word that I will use throughout the presentation. And the tension at very face value, like first impressions, seem to be about the addition of non-governmental organizations. And the messaging seemed to be that the global north were, yay, let's add them, and the global south was saying no. And having been to several of these meetings, I knew that there was something here that needed to be explored further. There was more in this room that met the eye, and this is what I have trained myself for. What are the hidden messages in spaces where we just tend to believe the main message? And I also just want to say, while divisions between the global north and the global south are becoming increasingly blurred because there are so many global south countries now that have a lot of power, maybe even more than many global north countries. In this room and in this negotiating space, the divide was very clear. There was a real clear division between interests of the global north and the global south, and I will tell you what they are as I proceed with the presentation. So power and climate change has so many layers, right? And this is something that Erica already told you during my introduction, from policy to political spaces, to scientific spaces, to the towns and communities where climate policies are implemented. And I try to study all of this. In a way, what I try to do is really challenge how we think about gender to just mean women. I think about gender in a way that that makes us think about social relations, social dynamics, right? And so there are so many social dynamics. There's so much power dynamics in climate change, and this happen between and within countries. They happen between and within countries and non-governmental organizations, NGOs. They happen between and among NGOs themselves, right? And what is so challenging to participate in a space like the Conference of the Parties is that you need to come to such a space to negotiate a single position. So as an entire country, you just need to negotiate one position. This automatically already means that there's going to be some perspectives that are not going to be heard. And the same thing happens with NGOs, right? So for instance, I've done a lot of work on the constituency of women and gender. And so a lot of these dynamics are also happening in such a space where instead of having many messages around how diverse women are and how many problems they encounter beyond a single one, in such a platform, they can only choose one. Okay, so in a way, I think this is going to be key to understand. It is a space that requires a certain style of participation, and it is the structural barriers that really inhibit trying to achieve a really complex process of decision-making, right? I mean, it's just the entire world coming together, trying to decide what best path to take for our global humanity, for our commons. So I've been talking about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and now I'm signaling where these negotiations around climate change happen, right? So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change offers a platform for countries to come together to state their position. And while a lot of climate action happens outside of these formal negotiating spaces, these are really important to study because things do happen here, even though for those of you following, it might seem that it's a very slow process, but the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated here, the Paris Agreement, which probably some of you have heard of, which is basically trying to not overshoot 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, which unfortunately we're not on the correct trajectory, but we are doing better than before the Paris Agreement. So there are baby steps. So those are happening. And so the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC is a yearly meeting that addresses global progress to reduce the negative impacts of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. It began and it's ongoing since 1992 during the Rio Earth Summit of the UN Conference on Environment and Development. And I said this already, but many powerful actors, governments, businesses, NGOs come to participate. So it really is a good place to study power dynamics. So I use the Conference of the Parties as a very localized global space. And that's my geographer training, right? I use the COPs because the Conference of the Parties, because they can provide a snapshot of global climate governance dynamics, right? It's really hard to go study this. Like, how would you do it? And you could travel around the world and see how people do things, but you could also just go to a place where all these people with power come together, sit around the table, and pay attention to how decisions are being made, who's speaking, who is not speaking. And I mean, it's a very simple process in a way, but I'm going to show you how it can be nuanced and how it's good that we use nuance for what we observe in these spaces. So while countries, nation states, seem to be the main players during the Conference of the Parties, they are the voting members. there are many actors involved with different degrees of influence. And I try to pay attention to that, right? For instance, the gender and women's constituency is a group that I follow and see what they're doing in terms of transforming climate policy, global climate policy. I have been to a few Conference of the Parties here. I'm just giving you a few snapshots of the last two that I went to. So that one was during 2015, that was during Paris. And then the last one that I went to, where you can see we're already wearing masks, that was 2021 in Glasgow. And the fact that so many heads of state come to this meeting, so for instance, 157 attended the one in Paris, and 100 attended, or over 100 attended the one in Glasgow, just goes to show that it is an important item on the global agenda. And it is party delegates that have the vote, like I said, but they are not the only actors in this space. Observer organizations have power to influence climate government, and some believe that they also offer the promise to overcome governmental failures, the slowness of decision-making that occurs in the procedural governmental protocols. They can also create pressure, for instance, by shaping the public narrative, for example, by generating empathy, and they can also create relationships. There are NGOs and specific people that have been going since 1992, right? And in a way, you can see how networking, creating relationships becomes really key, especially for people that do not have a vote, right? But just talking to people constantly about your mission, your agenda, can help advance your agenda even if you're not a voting member. And I just wanted to give you a snapshot here when I talk about NGOs, how they are represented at the Conference of the Party. So you can see that there's youth and women, indigenous peoples. A large part of it are environmental organizations, but I also just wanted to point out that NGOs also incorporate businesses, right? And I think many of us maybe do not think about that, but I think it's an important point because there are a lot of businesses that do really push, fossil fuels in these climate negotiations. So it creates interesting dynamics when we just talk about, who's going to resolve the climate crisis. But there's an increasing belief that one of the big problems for why we're not achieving effective climate governance is because governments are just unable to deprioritize their own national agendas. And so some believe that the solution is to move away from this top-down, centralized arrangement to the bottom-up, participatory, more democratic governance arrangement, right? So one of the solutions is just add more people. And in this case, how more people participate are through non-governmental organizations. What is interesting to me, and what I do not lose track of, is what happens to the global north and south dynamics as more actors enter that debate, because there has been a lot of attention to how NGOs participate in the space, how they influence, but what I want to keep track of is how this addition is changing dynamics of actual voting members. And so I'm going to give you an example from the case study from when I went to the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. And I was following the advisory board composition for the Center for Technology and Climate Change. A question that I ask in most of the research and work that I do that I think applies really well in terms of just thinking of my broad research agenda in terms of power and climate change is what are the mechanisms by which some voices are heard while others are silenced in climate change negotiations in this case, but in climate change more broadly. So just to give you a rundown of, for those of you who have not been to the Conference of the Parties or participated in Model UN programs, what do negotiations usually look like? Like this. You enter a room and people are seated around a table and they're working on a text. It's all words. Words are power. They matter so much. Usually, NGOs do not have a seat at the table, again, because they're not voting members. So if they're in the room, and they can be seated next to specific delegations or party delegates, again, trying to promote their agenda. So for instance, if you're a gender and women constituency representative and you have made friends, good friends with, say, Mexico, this happens, then Mexico can try to support issues that the women and genders constituency thinks are important, right, for certain negotiations. So that is how NGOs have managed to influence, usually. And during these meetings, there's also, they're hard to follow because people are not just having regular conversations. It is very much like reading the terms of agreement when you sign up for a website, right? You're like, what's going on? Yes, sure, okay. So, and how the meeting occurs is, again, it's not a conversation, so you respond. If someone says something that you want to respond to, you need to wait your turn, which means that maybe 5 more people are going to go ahead of you responding to somebody before them, right? And things, and a lot of the interventions that occur have so many hidden messages that it might take you a while to be like, oh, I now understand what that intervention actually means, and you might respond to one intervention, maybe, you might not even get to respond. But what I'm trying to say here is that it is a very difficult process to follow. For me, it was very difficult to reconstruct the story. I'm gonna tell you one story, but there's so many other things happening simultaneously. And so for newcomers, this is a real difficult space to really understand. Yet, part of why they admit people like me, we're called observers, right? We're also non-governmental organizations. I would be an independent one, but we're supposed to be there to see how things are done. But seeing how things are done requires a lot of time and effort and in a way training, right? And so if, I'm confused, but then it might happen that delegates, if they don't or countries, if they don't have enough people, they might just bring whomever is available or whomever can come. And sometimes they send people that are not fluent in UN speak, right? So you have a lot of people sitting around the table, but only few are speaking, right? Sometimes some people are there just to make sure that an agenda item does not get called, that your party really does not want, right? And that's when there's interventions. But usually the conversation will be dominated by a few actors. So the meeting that I attended, I found out, was called Informal Consultation Agenda Review of the Center for Technology and Climate Change. I found out it was the 3rd meeting that was deciding the composition of the CTCN. And I noticed something unusual this time, right? I told you, usually it's just governmental bodies, party delegates at the table, but this time I noticed that there were NGO representatives sitting around the table, and I was like, this is going to be interesting, right? So that's why I knew that I should stay in this meeting, because I was like, this is an unusual thing, usually, again, observers sit behind, and the NGOs that were represented at the table were the Women and Gender constituency, the environmental one, ENGO, and YOUNGO, the youth. I'm not really going to talk about their interventions, but I'd love to discuss that during the Q&A if anyone is curious. But I'll talk about them as a whole, which is also a little bit problematic, but this is how they were being talked about in this meeting, and you'll find out before I tell you more. So what is this CTCN? What is the Center for Technology and Climate Change Network? It is a specialized body working on technology. It's supposed to provide expertise to the UNFCCC, easier to access than other formal negotiations, which is another thing that obviously not all negotiations are open to observers, so there's a lot to have to navigate when you're in such spaces. So the CTCN was established after the Paris Agreement as the arm to implement the technology mechanism. And since in the Paris Agreement, it was agreed that we needed to curb greenhouse gas emissions, right? Technology is going to play a central role for that. And again, this meeting room provided a mirror into climate governance power dynamics more broadly. So the meeting began with the Secretariat, who's also the moderator. They're supposed to be the neutral party. They're the ones that tell you when you can speak, when you cannot speak, when to move things along, when the meeting begins, when it ends, presenting a text to the meeting room that had incorporated feedback from previous meetings. And this feedback is supposed to be agreed upon everybody in the meeting. And I knew this was going to be interesting because as the Secretariat presents the text and also pressures people to come to a decision, they were saying, please, let's maximize progress. There was some pressure to come to a decision. There immediately was an intervention noting that something in the text had been deleted and that they didn't remember that people agreed on that there was no consensus on text that had been deleted, and so there were some people in the room that were trying to find out what was deleted, and probably people in the room were also thinking, what is that? What does that mean? What will that deletion mean in terms of a climate change agreement, right? And so an intervention went so far as to say, I do not think that this text is okay. So I was like, this is going to be good, right? And so I'm saying this came from the Global South because there started to be more interventions from the Global South agreeing with this intervention. So this is how I started recognizing a pattern. There was something that had been deleted in the text that was not okay with the Global South. An intervention from a Global North country, and by the way, here I'm just saying Global North and Global South, but these interventions are coming from countries, but I'm not telling you the countries because of the ethics committee. If I told you the countries, maybe you might find who they are. Or not, maybe not you, but somebody. So the Global North, and a country from the Global North said, without acknowledging that there was all this hesitation to move ahead, that people wanted to find out what was deleted, why was it deleted, why will it mean? There was no acknowledgement of that, and just an intervention saying, this text is good basis for discussion without going line by line. A lot of interventions, a lot of mess. Obviously, the meeting was not going to maximize progress, right? So the Secretariat intervenes and tries to explain, listen, the board must have no more than 18 members. This was another thing that was being discussed. They're like, why 18, right? Again, some people were like, keep the number to 18. That's a great number. That's what a board needs. And other people were like, why 18, right? So there were just a lot of consecutive discussions happening. But in order to keep 18 members, compromises needed to be made. And so the Secretariat ended their intervention by saying, let's not jeopardize the participation of some members. So which members are we talking about? And here an intervention, at least in what was happening in the meeting room, made it clear, an intervention from a representative of a global north country. Outside of the negotiating rooms, there is lots of talk of listening to youth, indigenous, women. Are we seriously suggesting that they deserve a lower status than existing observer members? So the dominant messaging in the room was that those who were being excluded were women, indigenous peoples, and youth. We don't want to do that. That is not a good look. So who's doing the excluding, right? Who's not wanting this addition? So I'm not going to tell you very much about decolonial feminist approaches, but this is what I use. This is the lens that I use. If anyone is interested, I'd love to share resources with you. But it forces you to check for nuance. So I took a double take on the dominant messaging in the room, and I asked myself, why would the Global South oppose addition of NGOs to the board? They're very diverse, they represent many interests, do very important work. Like, what is the big deal? So when you're looking for nuance, you're also looking for alternative stories, counter-narratives. And that's what I started looking for, right? Like, what are the stories that are being silenced? And so part of that effort goes together with studying the strategies of those who seem to have the power and the ways that they hold on to it, right? So how were their messages not being taken into consideration? So some of them that I observed were that, the Global North kept dismissing Global South concerns. They never acknowledged Global South's explanation of why they were stalling the meeting, of why they were thinking that the text was not okay. They were not comfortable moving on. And instead, they would accuse the Global South of being intolerant, right? It's shameful to not want to add NGOs that represent the interests of women and youth and indigenous peoples in climate change decision-making. Another strategy that was, blocking action was the Secretariat, who was supposed to be the neutral party, because they wanted to come to a decision, was showing dismay at the lack of progress. So there was some pressure there to actually come to a decision, even though that decision was not benefiting and not, most of the Global South was not happy with what was happening. And so inadvertently, it was supporting the Global North, or maybe knowingly, I'm not sure. And also, because these negotiations happen in a meeting room, right? It is really funny, but this actually was happening. The meeting had an end, and there was another scheduled meeting, right? In 30 minutes. So we needed to clear the room for another meeting. So this all happens when people are trying to make decisions about our common future. And so there was a lot of dominant narratives occurring. So the Global South felt very compelled to just really spell out, well, within some nuance, what the problem was. Of course, we support adding constituencies, and constituencies are these NGOs representing women, youth, indigenous people's interests. What is stopping us, And mine is Global South, so because they were never saying, right, it was just not that clear. But what is stopping us is having 2 representatives from financial institutions that were coming from the Global North. And so they proposed a solution. Removing them will still leave us with seats for finance and technology. So the way to participate in the board is that you are adding people with certain skills, but these skills are also represented by people from either the Global North or the Global South. So here they're just talking about positions, right? But this is how the nuance has to come out, and I had to do a lot of interviews and conversations with key informants to understand who was us and who else was taking on these positions. So then they were pretty clear. They said, we ask this particular country for indulgence and flexibility. That is what is stopping us. And so, really, very simple. To keep the number to 18 and to add NGOs, seats had to be redistributed. And it seems that the changes in the text had removed seats from Global South representatives, right? But it took such it was such complicated messaging that I could have reported a completely different story. I could have said, I went to a meeting and it was shocking. The Global South did not want to add constituencies. That's what I could have reported, right? Because that was the global messaging. And so another representative from the Global South noted this irony, and they said, having two consecutive discussions about increasing members while cutting off others sends a message in the wrong direction, right? There is something about talking about inclusion, right, at the expense of obscured forms of exclusion. So one of the things that I've been finding out is that as we are increasing participation in climate governance, it is important to question whether new actors are challenging or strengthening the dynamics that block climate action. Like to tackle climate change, we want people that are doing different things, that are thinking differently, right? So if we're going to incorporate more people, it makes sense that we incorporate people that are changing what we are doing in terms of very little or a lot. I mean, we are acting to mitigate and adapt, but not enough, right? So if new actors are coming in, but they're not really shuffling any feathers, I think it's important to understand who is incorporating them and what's the reason behind this. And so the narrative of governments against NGOs is too simple. Like I said, like thinking about the Global North and the Global South and how that dynamic is also increasingly blurred, there are some NGOs that participate at the Conference of the Parties that are experts, okay, that have been going since 1992, that know everybody, that know how to work the room. And so many might have even more power and sway than many countries from the Global South. So while we're just adding new people, we cannot assume that there will be an automatic shift in power structures. And the graph that I'm showing you here is just that except for the COP20, which happened in Lima, in Peru, in Latin America, the Western and European representatives have been dominant in terms of who's representing NGOs, right? So here we can see also there's an overrepresentation of Global North non-governmental organizations. So this narrative of governments are not as efficient, NGOs are more efficient, let's just add more, obscures unresolved power dynamics between governments, right? It is allowing some governments to act as if they care about certain issues, but the reality is that they might just be advancing their own agenda. And I think, if we want to work toward effective climate policy, that it makes sense that the majority of the population, which is also the most vulnerable, should be spearheading climate action. And I think that centering affected voices presents a larger potential to transform power relations in a way that really redistributes how we do things, how we tackle climate change. I mean, and this is just a really small thought exercise. What would climate action look like if it were not led by, countries that are very attached to political and economic systems that are not really benefiting the environment or people, but by people that are going to be under water, right, in a couple of years. So, I mean, I think that is a really powerful image. So climate justice is more of an aspirational approach because obviously we're not there yet, right? But I think in order to achieve it, it is so vital to recognize and correct longstanding imbalances, to not perpetuate the dynamics that continue to disadvantage those who have contributed the least to climate change, but also climate change has made them more vulnerable. So it's like double whammy. Addressing social inequality should be a prerequisite to address climate change, right? Because like I said before, it's not that climate change makes people more vulnerable, although now that might not be true, but climate change is a magnifier of social inequality already, right? And so just to connect this to where we are, what's the relevance of this case study to the US context? One of them is that a global problem that does not respect political borders will not be resolved efficiently if we prioritize national interests. And if so many players around the world are already, preparing for what's to come, it might leave the United States, at least the government, at a disadvantage in terms of efforts to adapt and mitigate to climate change. And then as a global player that has many resources, it will also hamper opportunities to weather climate change for countries that need the external funding to adapt and mitigate, right? If we're saying that technology is going to be vital, how are they going to access that technology if they don't have the funds, right? So putting America first in international environmental agreements starts the process of withdrawing the United States from any agreement, pact, accord, or similar commitment made under the UNFCCC. And besides not contributing to tackling global climate change by not participating in climate governance, the United States government might also be missing out on money-making opportunities, right? As the UN climate chief, Simon Steele said in a recent speech, investors know that clean energy makes more sense. Twice as much was invested in clean energy than in fossil fuels, $2 trillion. So a country may step back, but others are already stepping into their place to seize that opportunity. And others also include within the United States. I think that we're seeing a moment where climate action is just simply too strong. Like the benefits and the problems associated with it are really driving people to act, right? Despite what governments are doing or not doing. Climate action is becoming the norm rather than the exception. And there's been reported bipartisan support for action. The Inflation Reduction Act has had unprecedented investment in clean energy, so including in 85% in counties that voted for Trump. Voters approved 13 state and local climate and conservation initiatives. So I guess this is, I'm trying to say there's hope in terms of, where climate action lies, right? There's so many places that it can occur. But this is also one of the problems that I'm afraid of, is that as people are seeing investing in clean energy as beneficial and even a money-making opportunity, what I'm afraid of is if we're not bringing up those that cannot afford the technologies, that cannot afford or invest in clean energy, right? If we stopped that support, then we're just increasing the gap between the haves and the have-nots. So I do think, like the CEO of the European Climate Foundation, Lawrence Tubiana, said that this moment should serve as a wake-up call to reform the system, ensuring that those most affected, communities and individuals on the front lines, are at the center of our collective governance. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Miriam, thank you so much for getting us started on this fascinating conversation. Appreciate it. Yes. It's time for some conversation, and you know our house rules. We are happy to have your participation, asking questions that are respectful and succinct. And those of you who are with us on the live stream, you can text 616-308-6560 if you've got a question. Of course, you could do that if you're here in the audience too, 616-308-6560, or you can use the chat channel in our YouTube broadcast. So who's interested in starting out the dialogue with Dr. Gay-Antaki?
So earlier you were talking about the number of seats that were available, and you said 18. I'm not sure if I heard the reason why, though. You were asking the question, like, why 18 specifically, and I'm wondering that too.
Nobody knows.
Oh my God.
I mean, it was in a way, and I'm glad you asked that question. There was, instead of saying things how they are, there was a lot of this techno-managerial speak. So a lot of the conversation was like, what's the best number for a board? And so some people were like, I have read in the book of management of whatever that 22 is the magic number. And then other people were like, well, at the Lancet, they have, 37 people. But 18 was just, in a way, a tool to be like, whatever we have here is what is going to stay. This is what we like. We like the amount of people participating from the global north and the amount of people that are participating from the global south, and we also incorporated the NGOs that were looking to be members of the board. So there was no convincing logical explanation as to why they wanted to keep that number. Yeah.
Was the Secretariat from the Global North or the Global South?
What do you think?
A follow-up question, but I'm curious, when we look at the NGOs, I'm assuming that most of them get much of their funding from the global north, and does that add to that power dynamic that even though they may ostensibly be, working towards the goals of countries in the global south, they're not necessarily a part of or maybe seen as representing those interests as well as countries, because there is that sense of being connected to the global north.
Yes, but they also don't vote. I mean, I think that was key. They're not voting members. So you can add 100 NGOs to your board, but they will not be voting, right? So, but if you're counting them as you're counting global north or global south representatives, but they're not voting, then you're reducing who's voting, right? And so, I mean, I didn't talk about it because I don't have time, and part of this research I'm publishing a paper in Global Environmental Politics that covers this aspect, but it also covers a few more. But it was really interesting to try to see how the arguments for adding the NGOs, right? Because that was a really complex dynamic also. Because they were at the table at some point, they were asked to speak. They were asked to represent, to make a case for why the board should incorporate the women's constituency or the indigenous people's constituency, or the indigenous people's constituency was not there, but the other NGOs were wanting to incorporate them. And so it was really interesting because some of the hesitation was that people did not see these NGOs being sufficiently diverse enough. They saw them as they're like, well, those, you who are in the gender and women's constituency, you're also in the youth constituency, and you're also in the environmental constituency, so why do you need 3 seats? Right? So there was just really interesting questions around identity politics. And so they were trying to say, well, I don't know, like the youth has different interests than women, but then this young person was also female. So it created really interesting dynamics as to like what role they could play in the board, but they were not going to vote, right?
You talked about the different constituencies, and you just identified it like the women's constituency. But did you observe the impact of the gender of those who were from the governments or the seated members? And I didn't think you really commented on that during the conversation, because you could have, from the global north, you could have women representatives ostensibly representing their government, but it could be a woman or it could be a man, but not representing their specific. Any observations or comments arising from that?
Yes, I love that question. It's a great question because as a party member, you're not allowed to have a gender. Because that's the thing that is very complex about these constituencies. That's the place to talk about gender. If you are a government representative who has the body of a female or has, some that lives the life of a woman, you cannot talk about that because you're not supposed to. The space to talk about women's issues is in that constituency. And so that is one of the things that I think is really problematic. Right? Because if there are indigenous peoples in the meeting room, in representing some of the countries, they cannot advocate for indigenous peoples, right? Because that happens in the constituency. But then again, these constituencies do not vote. So it creates really complex dynamics. Like I would ask women like government representatives, I was like, what do you think about gender, and they would always be like, oh yeah, what the constituency is doing is really important. And I was like, how about you and your experience and what you're trying to do here? No, that's not what they're doing, because they're representing their government's position. And unless it's like a meeting set to negotiate gender, which that's another paper, another part of my research, then people who are in the room are not negotiating that, right? They're negotiating the composition of the board.
Hi. I can appreciate your wanting to finish on an optimistic note about the progress within the U.S. However, currently as we stand here, our government is in the middle of a smash and grab theft that's occurring. And my point being, and my question is, I read over the weekend where major universities are meeting to brainstorm how they, address these unprecedented attacks on their funding, like we've seen with research funding to universities and the devastation this might cause. Is there anything that you can say that would be similar, or that people probably aren't looking at it yet, but could you see the need for, with the influence of the U.S., do you see the need for immediate emergency meetings for people to get together who are within the IPCC to address that threat posed by the current government here?
The threat of removing DI programs from funding, I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess what about the IPCC? Do you want me to address just in general, like if there needs to be like urgent meetings?
Sustainability officers for various universities were meeting this weekend to brainstorm. It was almost like an emergency.
I mean, I think so much of work around sustainability, the environment, climate change is very much linked to thinking about differential impacts. I mean, until very recently, I mean, the Conference of the Parties, that the addition of different voices is growing more and more and more and more. So that's the thing, like internationally, it is kind of not even, it's not a thing to be like, yeah, okay, we need to diversify who does climate science. We need to incorporate voices that are not heard, right? It's just very, like this is the problem, that it's already happening. It's already at like full speed in terms of trying to incorporate this. So I think what will happen in the United States in terms of like academic settings or any space that tries to do that is that they're just going to try to continue doing the work, but probably without governmental funding, but that doesn't mean that there's no funding, right? Or interest globally. Yeah.
We've got more audience questions, but here's a question from our remote audience. You mentioned the importance of centering the voices of those most affected by climate change, especially from the global south and marginalized groups. What are some concrete solutions you would like to see pursued to ensure these voices not only have a seat at the table, but also have a real influence in shaping climate policy going forward? Curious what your current vision is for the future.
Easy question. Well, I think recognizing how certain structures advance the voices of those who already have a voice, that the platforms that exist are not necessarily the platforms that we need for change, that the mechanisms of coming to agreements on equal terms are there, right? So, I mean, in a way, that's what I advocate for. It's like, yes, you can add as many people as you want, but if you do not change the mold, those people are going to be really uncomfortable trying to be there, and they're not even going to be able to breathe, right? Because they're not given the space to be different, to voice different opinions. So I think just a very concrete thing could just be to recognize why they don't have that voice at the beginning, and that these platforms might not be the most adequate in terms of providing that, in terms of hearing the voices that need to be heard the most, and acting on that, right? And the other thing is that if we need resources to act, and which we do, there needs to be like real serious mobilization of those resources. And I mean, the climate fund and all of these things have just not met the goals that they were intending to. So it's a global problem that's going to be difficult to assess, but there's spaces that can serve as examples. And I think maybe a small classroom can, but I mean, I do think it's a really complicated question. But I do think by pointing out very specific dynamics, right? I mean, in a way, that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm like, this is what happens in a room. So maybe if we understand what happens in a room, we can say, maybe don't do that. Like, stop it with the number 18, right? Like, what's up with that, right? So I think maybe if we're in a room and we're recognizing the dynamics, that those can be changed, like baby steps. But I mean, it is hard, right? Because it feels that there's no time for baby steps.
Hello. So the power dynamics discussion is fascinating, but I just can't help but go beyond that and ask about the results. So, I mean, you talked about climate action taking place in many different areas, thankfully. Your discussion of the UN didn't convince me that the things that are happening at the UN are actually going to be impactful. So I was curious as to the outcome of all of this discussion came out with a text. Was your conclusion that was impactful at the end of the day?
The resolution?
The resolution. The
no, that's no. That meeting ended the next day being like saying, oh, we didn't really, like we're incorporating the NGOs, but we're not sure what their role will be in the board, so we'll revisit that next year. I mean, I'm trying not to be horribly pessimistic, right? I'm trying to say, important things do happen here, but a lot of things might not happen exactly because they happen at a different pace that is maybe not adequate to what changes we need to make right now. But what I am trying to say is that not all the changes that are needed now are happening there, right? And that is what a lot of the non-governmental organizations that go there tell you all the time. They're like, we're just here to make sure that it doesn't go like really bad, but all of the work that we do is every day, and it's outside of these places.
Somewhat in line with what he was saying, if I recall, the kind of conclusion of the most recent COP, a statement came out that said, the burning of fossil fuels is the cause of, the climate crisis. Am I correct in that?
I don't know. That would be. I mean, maybe not in those clear words, but probably around that.
Yeah. So a statement came out,
Okay.
Something similar to that. I'm paraphrasing, and I'm just to his point. Now that we've got this baseline, which everybody knew a long time ago, at least the people involved. Will there be any impact? Will that statement, is it enforceable? Does it cause any change?
I mean, I think, and this is something that it's important to bring up, even though changes don't occur at the pace that we want them to. The Conference of the Parties provide platforms to create these narratives and these dialogues so that then people can go the next year and create pressure. So I do think change comes eventually, but it does create a platform, right? Like we do get to hear concerns of other people and calling out truth to power in these spaces, right? There's a lot of that happening, and a lot of, like, there's a fossil of the day that, and they showcase who's been like the worst party, like the worst delegate, and there's a lot of things like that, and no one wants to be the fossil of the day, right? So I think it's again, we think about climate governance as this big thing, but I think we should think about it as little things, like little interactions that eventually, hopefully, I don't know. I try to stay hopeful, but change happens, but not at the pace that I think we wanted to, not in terms of like governments, but again, change is happening at different scales at different sites. Yeah.
So just to add on to the constituencies and how you're talking about that they are problematic, which I agree with, I think it's very interesting that they don't want gender a part of like the actual government decision making, or the interactions between them. I'm wondering, how exactly can we even make a positive impact if we're completely denying our identities and acting almost more like a piece of technology than a person? Because aren't our connections to the land and to our ecosystems key to actually making that change, and our identities are tied to that? How could we possibly get them to like understand that humanity and our identities is a key to making these positive changes?
Yeah, I really appreciate that, right? And I think maybe that's probably better advice than what I gave about what changes we can make, but certainly, right, the recognition of who we are is very much tied to love of a certain place that we want to see thriving, right? If, like, at least surviving. And how the negotiations are run in these spaces, you're supposed to be an objective party. Like, you're not supposed to bring any emotion, because again, you're representing your country's interest, and that's, I think, a limiting factor, right? You cannot represent your interest because you're representing your country's interest. So you could be totally opposed to what you're defending, but if you're working for that representing what, and that's the other thing, like, moving agendas along is really complicated, because if your country has not signed a position, or if you have no information on how your country feels about a certain position, you cannot let that advance. You would need to find out, you'd need time to figure out what your country has signed and ratified, and if it's okay to support that. So it's like a very distancing process. It definitely does not allow what you're saying, and so I think that would be an incredible thing to permit. Right? Those who are there maybe are not representing their countries, but are representing that they care about the world and they want it to not burst in flames.
We have another question from our remote viewers. In this part of the world, climate change has been a politically charged issue, to put it mildly, and it is sometimes hard to imagine minds changing. In your experience, have you ever seen people or groups evolve their stance on climate change, and what helped precipitate that change?
Well, I think here I'm just giving an example. I think it's a little problematic, but it's happening. It's there's possibilities to make a profit now. Like it's changing. Like how we think about climate change is not as partisan as it used to be. So we're seeing that happen. I'm not sure if that's the way to move, right? Kind of like we're perpetuating dynamics that are already problematic in terms of using resources and who gets to use them. Ideally, it would be because we care about each other, our neighbors, the environment. And that could happen also, but I guess right now the market makes the moves, and the market is showing that, investing in clean energy and trying to adapt and mitigate to climate change makes sense.
Let's thank Dr. Gay-Antaki for a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Intriguing conversation. It's given us much to think about. And her talk will be available at the World Michigan YouTube channel. If there's someone you think that should see this presentation and interact with it, you'll be able to point them to World Michigan at the YouTube site. Next week, we're going to turn our attention to NATO. Again, 75 years old. And we have an interesting guest from the Dutch government, former Dutch parliamentarian, Geert-Jan Segers, will be with us. And he's going to talk to us about NATO from a European perspective, which should be very, very interesting. So come back week from today, same place, same time. Thank you.